This video, organized by Fort Valley State University and AgriUnity Foods North America, features Dr. Nancy Hinkle, an entomologist from University of Georgia, and Dr. Lee Jones, veterinarian from Boehringer Ingelheim, talking about fly control and New World Screwworm.
Thank you, Dr. Whitley. I appreciate your hospitality tonight. So starting off talking about flies on cattle, it's the ongoing perpetual problem. If you live in the Southeast, actually if you live anywhere in the world, you're going to have flies on cattle. And the main fly we deal with, of course, is the horn fly. This is a patch of horn flies. You can identify them individually, but it's much easier to just see this and go, yep, those are horn flies. Horn flies typically occur in numbers. They can be just a few dozen, or it can be thousands, actually. You hope you don't see that. But the horn flies are blood-sucking insects. They've got to have blood. They take a blood meal about once an hour, and they do that 24 hours a day because they stay on the animal. Their behavior is just that once they find a cow, they stay on the herd. They may move from one animal to another if they're close together, but they're going to stay there because, again, they've got to have another blood meal in an hour or so, and they don't want to get too far from the herd. I hope you haven't seen this, but there's a good chance you have. If you see that cloud up over to the left corner there, that's all horn flies that have emerged from the herd below. And as you can see, these animals have been wallowing in the mud, trying to prevent the flies from getting to their skin. It hasn't been too successful, apparently, because they're certainly producing a lot of flies. And that's aggravating. They bite, and when they bite, it causes pain. And so the animals are constantly feeling these little bites in their skin, their little pinches, and it's enough to keep them constantly agitated. The point with beef cattle is we want them grazing, we want them gaining weight. If they're spending all their time being distracted by flies, they're not grazing. It also increases their body temperature, which is not conducive to growth. And they're spending a lot of time just moving around, swinging their tails, flinging their head, trying to get rid of these obnoxious flies. And that's not what we want. We would like to have nice passive cows that are out there grazing, keeping their body temperature down so they can continue to put on muscle. The adult horn fly, as I said, feeds about once an hour, 24 hours a day, day and night. And as you can see, you've got large numbers there. Now remember, I'm an entomologist, not a photographer, so these are pretty lousy pictures, but I think you get the idea. There can be a lot of horn flies. They can be pretty much a solid sheet on the side of the animal. And each one of those, remember, is piercing the skin of that cow at least once an hour, all day long, all night long. Not all at one time, but enough so that the cow is pretty much constantly in pain. It's been estimated that horn flies cost our U.S. cattlemen over $1 billion per year. And with the current price of beef, that's probably a vast underestimation. Cattle weaning weights are 20 pounds heavier when we successfully control horn flies. Unfortunately, we don't really have any way right now to successfully control horn flies. It's a constant battle. We have a few things that work partially, and if we are conscientious about it and do things exactly right, we can reduce the numbers of horn flies, but there's no way we can completely eliminate horn flies from a herd. The thing about horn flies is they lay their eggs in the manure. They are very closely tied to the host. In addition to feeding just on cattle blood, they also only lay their eggs in cattle dung. So they've got to find a manure pat, lay their eggs there, the maggots hatch, the maggots feed on the manure, and they grow up in the manure. The larva looks pretty much like any maggot out there. It's just a little nondescript worm-looking thing. And that's what feeds on the manure, grows up, gets larger, and when the maggot has gotten as large as it's going to get, it then goes through the pupal stage. So you start out with the maggot, which is over on the left, just gets shorter and stubbier, and then the outside of it gets hardened. It dries and forms a hard case, which we call the pupal case. So you see, you move from the color of the maggot to the first pupil. The pupil case there first looks pretty much the same color as the maggot. Then it gets a little darker and turns kind of a reddish brown. And then just before the adult fly emerges from that pupil case, it's almost black. If you're ever on Jeopardy and you need to know the scientific name of the hornfly, it's Hematobia irritans. It is irritating to the cow, and it certainly lives up to its name. We've been conducting a lot of studies on hornflies through the years. We have tested the products that are available in the field. We've tagged cattle, we've sprayed on insecticides, we've poured on insecticides, we've done all sorts of testing. And we go out weekly then after we've treated the animals, and we assess the populations on the animals to determine how long the products last and how effective they are at suppressing hornflies. As I said, the things that we test include the insecticidal ear tags, pour-on formulations, just like every producer uses. And we also looked at the feed-through insecticides. Now, these, of course, are not adulticides. They're not going to kill the adult flies. The way they work is they are swallowed, they pass through the gastrointestinal tract, and they come out in the manure. So they're actually treating the manure, kind of pre-treating the manure, if you think about it. So every fecal material that comes out of the anus of that cow is treated with the insecticide. That is assuming that the animal is getting access to the product. Now, in any herd, you've got dominant cows and you've got submissive cows, and sometimes the dominant cows eat all the food and don't leave anything for the low girl on the totem pole, and she doesn't get much. And that's why it's important to know your herd and be able to put out enough of the material so that every animal in the herd gets treated, gets a dose of this product. And here we got 3 different products. Alticid is an insect growth regulator, virtually no mammalian toxicity, passes right through, comes out in the manure. Dimilin, right below it there, is another insect growth regulator, but with a different mode of action. Same way, it's swallowed, passes through the gastrointestinal tract, comes out in the manure. And then in the lower right-hand corner, we have Rabon. Rabon is actually an organophosphate insecticide. But since this product does not get digested, it never gets into the bloodstream, it never gets into the meat, it doesn't get into the muscle, so it poses no risk of food danger because it stays in the gastrointestinal tract, which is what we want it to do. We want it to go all the way through and come out in the manure because that's the only way it's going to kill the maggots when the eggs are laid in the manure pile. So again, the point is to get the insect growth regulator into the manure. And the best way to do that, instead of you walking around your pasture and spraying each individual manure pat, is to feed each cow with the active ingredient, and then it just by itself treats its own manure, so that when the manure comes out, it's already containing the active ingredient. Again, this does not affect the adult flies. Remember, the adult flies feed on blood. The blood does not contain the insecticide. So you never get the effect on the blood, on the meat, on the muscle, any other part of the animal. It stays in the intestines, stomach, passes out, comes out in the manure. When it comes right down to it, we really only have 4 modes of action of insecticides for controlling flies on cattle. And they are listed here. You're all familiar with the macrocyclic lactones. Those are the ivermectin products, the relatives abamectin, doramectin, aprenomectin, moxidectin, those sorts of things. That's one class. Then you have the ones we were just discussing, the feed-through, the insect growth regulators, diflubenzuron and methoprene are the technical names for these. And they have different modes of actions. Then we have the organophosphates. Now, organophosphates have been around almost as long as I have. You recognize these names: diazinon, tetrachlorophenphos, coumaphos, phosmet, dichlorvos, pyrimaphos methyl. Those are all organophosphates. Not too surprisingly, we have pretty high levels of insecticide resistance to some of these, so they don't work as well as they did 40 or 50 years ago. And then finally, we have the class that's probably used the most, the pyrethroids and pyrethrins. Permethrin, of course, is the most recognizable name there, but you've got cypermethrin, cyfluthrin, lambda-cyhalothrin, and so on. We have been very pleased with these products when they came out. Oh, goodness, 40 years ago now. Yeah, they were amazing. They're very toxic to insects and have virtually no toxicity to mammals. So we could use them with impunity on our ag animals in animal agriculture without worrying about toxicity or food residues. Very impressive products. Of course, the problem is when something is really, really good, you get resistance to it really quick. So the pyrethroids killed off all the flies that were susceptible to the pyrethroids, leaving only the ones that were resistant. And those resistant flies then mated with each other, and the next generation was even more resistant. And so we've been doing that for 30 or 40 years now. And again, it's not too surprising that we see a pretty high level of insecticide resistance to the pyrethroids in many of our fly populations. Now, you may be the exception. Your herd may be completely susceptible to the pyrethroids. They're working great. More power to you. But unfortunately, the majority of producers cannot say that. So don't be too surprised if you're using the pyrethroids and they're not working as well as they did before. Every year, the University of Georgia updates the Georgia Pest Management Handbook. This is an old edition here, but they're pretty much all the same, or they cover the same material, but they update the recommendations. So we have the animal ag aspect there. It's about 50 pages that cover cattle and horses and pigs and sheep and goats and chickens and pretty much every type of animal agriculture that we have here in the state. And listed are the pests that we're treating for, and then recommendations for what is most effective against them. And this again is updated every year, so we have the things that are legal, and anything that is withdrawn or the EPA cancels then is removed from it. So it stays pretty current. You can buy this book online. There's a website, or you can just go to the website and look at the PDF and print out just the pages that you want. This book is over 500 pages, so it has corn and soybeans and figs and apples and everything that we raise in Georgia. I'm guessing since you attend this webinar tonight, you're probably more interested in animal agriculture and probably either small ungulates or horses or cows. So you can go just to that section, and if you want to, you can print out just the dozen or 2 dozen pages that are pertinent to what you're looking at.
And it's free, right? It's free
and
online.
It's free, that's right. Just if you have any trouble finding it, ask Dr. Whitley. She will show you where to find it. Now, screwworms. So you've heard the bad news. Yes, all of a sudden, screwworms are turning up in Texas and New Mexico. Back in the 60s, the screwworm was eradicated from the southeastern United States successfully. It's been gone for 60, 70 years now. We'd like to keep it that way, but it's showing up again. We know what works. We let our guard down, and it got back into the United States. That's enough preaching now, Dr. Hinkle. Okay. We talked the first part here about hornflies. What's distinctive about them? They're bloodsuckers. The problem is the adults. With screwworms, the problem is exactly the opposite. It's the larvae. So what is this? This is the adult fly of the screwworm. The screwworm is the immature stage, the larval stage of this fly right here. Now, there's nothing particularly distinctive about this fly, is it? It's kind of a pretty blue, got kind of reddish eyes, but it looks like essentially every blowfly that we have here in the southeastern United States. They're so nondescript that I don't even require my students to recognize it. So if you're going to identify this, take it to your extension office and have somebody who works with flies identify it. So, for instance, this one looks a lot like the one I was just showing you. but it's not a screwworm fly. So there are a lot of blue blowflies, blue-green blowflies in the southeastern United States that look a lot like the screwworm fly, but are not. Why are we concerned about screwworms? Well, so here's the adult female fly sitting in a wound. As you can see the edges of the wound there. And she has already laid a batch of eggs up here. Each female can lay a batch of about 200 to 300 eggs, and that can certainly increase the population rapidly. If each one of those hatches and successfully emerges as an adult fly, then you've got a 300-fold increase in your population. And again, this fly, this adult fly, looks an awful lot like every other blowfly that we've got here in the southeastern United States. Where did we get screwworms? Have they always been here? No. Screwworms first arrived in Georgia in 1933 in a shipment of cattle from out west. Screwworms had been in the Central and South America as long as humans have been recording history. And then they started moving north. They got into Mexico, and they got into Texas. And the Texans were dealing with screwworms, and then they were exporting some of their cattle, and cattle haulers brought them to Georgia, and they spread throughout the southeastern United States. They were pretty much everywhere. Florida had a horrible problem because, of course, it never gets cold enough in Florida to completely kill them off. Here in Georgia, we had 4 or 5 months every year where we didn't have to worry about them, but they were pretty bad the rest of the year. But my father does remember back in the 30s when his father, he was 8 or 9 years old, his father would send him out every morning before he went to school to check the milk cows to make sure that the calves didn't have screwworms in their navels. So if he found screwworms in the navels, he had to scrape them out, and then he had to apply pine tar as a physical repellent. So the screwworm fly couldn't get through the pine tar to lay any more eggs in the wound. And that's how they treat it. Now, of course, with the calf laying down and licking and all, soon the pine tar wore away. So he pretty much had to do this every morning before he went off to school. And he said it was pretty disgusting. Now, my father was not a wimp, but I think for an 8-year-old boy, that would make quite an impression. Now, why is it called a screwworm? Okay, use your imagination. That worm, that larva over on the right there is a larval screwworm. You can almost see that those ridges look like the threading on a screw. So that's why it's called a screwworm. It vaguely resembles a screw. I didn't name it. That's just where it came from. And the distinctive feature about screwworms is that they feed only on living flesh. This is not a maggot that you're going to find in a dead dog on the side of the road. This maggot is only found in living animals. If the animal dies, the screwworms leave, and they either die because they're not far enough along in their development, or they manage to pupate and emerge as adult flies. So you look over there at the horse back leg there on the left, and you can actually see some of the maggots crawling around in that wound. And that's what they have done, the damage they have done there. That wound probably started out as either a tick bite or maybe a scratch from a barbed wire fence, but it made enough of an opening and produced enough of an aroma that the adult female screwworm flew in, laid a batch of eggs there. Those eggs hatched, and the maggots have been eating away at the wound, making it larger and larger and doing considerable damage. Now, the maggots don't look all that distinctive either. Again, they're the same size as other maggots, and really the only difference about screwworms is that they feed on living tissue. They will not feed on dead things. They don't feed on fecal material. You won't find them in manure piles. They feed only on living tissue. Here's a brief overview of the life cycle. In the upper left-hand corner, you've got that female on the wound again, laying a batch of eggs. And as I said, each one of the females can lay 200 to 300 eggs at a time. Those eggs then hatch. The maggots burrow into the wound, as you see in the upper right-hand corner there. And interestingly, they've got their heads. The pointed end is the head. The heads are down because the mouth parts are continuously scraping and eating the meat, eating through the muscle tissue. If you look at the blunt end, that's the rear end, and you see those two little black dots there? Those are actually the openings to their respiratory system, like our nostrils. And if you think about this, this is a pretty neat adaptation. So the maggot is able to eat continuously. That little pointed end is continuously feeding and consuming the muscle tissue. But with the rear end sticking out above the tissue, they can breathe at the same time that they're eating. Now, when I try to do that, I choke and make a fool of myself. But these maggots have emerged the ability to do this. They can feed and they can breathe at the same time. Then when the larvae have gotten as big as they're going to get, if you look down in the lower right-hand corner, you see the pupae in the soil. The maggots emerge from the wound, fall to the ground, burrow into the soil, and form that pupal case that we talked about when we were talking about horn flies. Well, now within that pupal case, it's going to turn into a fly. Look in the lower left-hand corner, the fly then is going to pop the end off that pupal case, crawl up through the soil, and fly away, looking for a mate. And if the female finds an animal and lays a batch of eggs, then you're going to have an animal that is infested with screwworms. And how can you tell that? Well, if you know your animals, you'll probably notice changes in behavior. And that's the great thing about people who watch their animals and know their herd. The animal affected will look irritated and depressed, may have lost its appetite. It'll be shaking its head if it's infested in the head, and sometimes these maggots get into the ears or into the nose or into other tissue like the mouth. If you get close enough, you can smell decaying flesh, and then you can actually see the maggots in the wounds. Obviously, the animal is uncomfortable. It hurts. You've got something eating away at your body. Yeah, there's going to be pain and discomfort. And without human intervention, animals will not survive screwworm infestation. So this horse, if you look up there on the back, you can see a wound there. If it goes untreated, then that animal will die. We humans inflict a lot of wounds that can potentially draw in screwworms. We put in ear tags, that makes a hole, makes a wound that would be perfectly acceptable to a screwworm. When a calf is born, you've got navels. This is any mammal. When they're born, they have a navel, and that's certainly an attractive area that would draw in screwworms. Castration wounds, dehorning wounds, branding wounds, fighting wounds. You get a couple of bulls out there, and they're fighting for territory. They'll damage one another. And again, it doesn't take a big hole. You just need something big enough to exude a little blood, and that will call in screwworms from long distances. And screwworms do have a very wide host range, essentially parasitizing any warm-blooded animal. Georgia has 1.2 million white-tailed deer. Each one of those then could be a potential nursery for thousands of screwworm larvae. So even if we do everything right with our domestic animals, we've still got the potential for huge populations of screwworms being produced by wildlife. Not just white-tailed deer, raccoons, possums, foxes, coyotes, every wild animal out there, rabbits, and so on. In the upper right-hand corner there, then you've got swine, perfectly good host for screwworms. Lower right-hand corner there, domestic animals. Yes, our pets, dogs and cats, horses, whatever, can be a perfectly good home for screwworm larvae. So any mammal, any warm-blooded animal can potentially be a home for screwworms. Now you're going to be hearing about this sterile insect technique. What does that mean? Well, the male flies from a colony, a human-raised colony, are sterilized using radiation. And this sterilization here, we're not talking about getting rid of bacteria and viruses and fungi. No, we're talking about sexual sterilization, where we're removing their ability to produce viable sperm. That renders their sperm inactive, and that's what we call the sterile male. Then millions of these sterile male flies are released by air over these screwworm-infested areas. And doesn't that sound weird? Why in the world are we releasing more flies when we're trying to get rid of these blasted flies? But there's a strategy here. Interestingly, for this species, the wild female screwworms mate with the sterile males. Once she's had sex one time, she loses all interest in sex and will never mate again. So, if we can ensure that every male that she finds and the male that she mates with are sterile, she can have sex, but she will not get impregnated. There will not be viable sperm. Her eggs will not be fertilized. So she will die without ever producing viable eggs. This shows how the screwworm was eradicated back in the 50s and 60s. If you see, the Southeast was the first to successfully get rid of them. That was back in the 50s. And interestingly, the government was not interested in this program when it was first proposed. But the cattlemen in Florida were so desperate to get rid of screwworms that they actually taxed themselves and funded the program to demonstrate that screwworms could be eradicated using the sterile insect technique. It worked in Florida, so the surrounding states adopted the same practice. The USDA got involved. They started raising huge numbers of screwworms, and they were able to successfully eradicate the screwworm from the Southeast in 2 years. Pretty impressive. Well, the western part of the country said, hey, that works. We want to get rid of it too. They did the same thing. By mid-60s, they had eradicated screwworms. Now, as you can see, there's a pretty wide border between Mexico and the United States. So it took a while to prevent screwworms from being able to fly across the border every year. And the United States actually collaborated with Mexico to eradicate screwworms from Mexico because we knew that we would be constantly fighting re-entry of screwworms if we didn't go ahead and just get rid of them in Mexico, so we didn't have to worry about them constantly showing up from Mexico. As you can see, it took a few years. They pushed them south through Mexico, then down through Central America in the 80s. And by early 2000s, they had successfully eradicated screwworms from Central America down to Panama. And they produced, or they made a laboratory there, or a warehouse, a factory essentially, where they could produce millions of screwworm flies. And they continued doing that for the next 20 or 30 years. And they continued to release sterile male screwworms in Panama so that any screwworms flying up from South America would get to Panama, then they would more likely mate with a sterile male and again would never produce offspring. So that's the sterile insect technique. It relies on a couple of things: the ability to produce huge numbers of sterile male flies, and secondly, the fact that a female screwworm will mate only once. So the odds are in our favor. If we can just flood the area with sterile males, we can almost ensure that every female screwworm fly out there will find only sterile males to mate with. This is a picture of the facility here down in Mexico where they've been Panama, where they've been raising these flies. That huge building on the right there is the actual production facility. Inside there, they've got racks and racks of habitat for these screwworms to lay their eggs, hatch, mature, and then they take the maggots, allow them to pupate. So then they take these pupae that are formed when these maggots pupate, they take the pupal cases and they run them through a machine that irradiates them. And of course that scrambles up their DNA so that the sperm are no longer viable. They cannot then impregnate a female screwworm fly. Once they've done that, then they take those flies, load them onto airplanes, fly over the areas where they're finding viable screwworm flies, viable screwworms, release these flies, and then the flies will find any host will find any females that are sexually available, and they'll mate and hopefully prevent those females from producing viable eggs. And this was a remarkable success, the sterile insect technique. The New World Screwworm is eradicated from North America, down through Mexico, down through Central America. And as I said, the eradication zone for over 2 decades there at the Darien Gap was maintained successfully. Of course, this depends on inspection of any animals that are imported from South America. If you bring in animals from South America that are infested with screwworms, you can jump over where the screwworms are being controlled and destroy the whole point of the program. So human inspection is critical to maintaining the workability of this process. Now, if you remember, 10 years ago, back in October of 2016, there was actually an outbreak of screwworms in the south part of Florida, way down in the Florida Keys. If you've been to the Florida Keys, you're familiar with the key deer. This is a white-tailed deer that is small, very small, miniature. They're only a little over knee-high. But they have a population there now, and there's only about 1,000 of them left. So they're considered representative of the Keys. So they found screwworms in some of these key deer, and it had quite an impact. Over the next 2 or 3 months, screwworms killed over 133 of these endangered key deer. And because their numbers are so low, they are listed as an endangered species or endangered subspecies. But the USDA jumped on this. They brought in sterile males, started releasing them around the area. And within 3 months, they had been able to eradicate screwworms from the Florida Keys. Now, I haven't mentioned this, but screwworms are not just found on wildlife and domestic animals. They're actually found in humans as well. They can infest human bodies. The picture in the upper left-hand corner there shows a person's mouth with a bunch of screwworms burrowing down into the gums there. And then on the upper right-hand corner, all of the screwworm larvae that were removed from that person's mouth. So he had quite a load of screwworms in his mouth. But it can happen. People who are unable to care for themselves, potentially this could occur. In the lower right-hand corner there, the CDC confirmed screwworm case in a Maryland traveler. This is somebody coming from South America. So yes, the potential exists for somebody coming back from traveling in South America to actually bring screwworms back and could possibly start an infestation wherever they land if they didn't get their situation treated. Humans, of course, are motivated by pain and fright, and they probably would have something done. But remember, these are insects, so antibiotics are not effective against insects. You don't treat these situations with antibiotics. So again, this is what the screwworm looks like. I talked about them digging into the flesh. You see those 2 little black teeth-like structures there? That's what they use to tear the tissue so that they can then consume it. That's how they manage to do all the destruction to the tissue and how they feed. And here's an individual from South America. You can see his jaw there with some pretty chunky screwworm larvae in a mass there in his jaw. So again, the sterile insect technique will work for eradication, but we also have to couple that with inspection of all animals that are transported from a screwworm-infested area. If you've worked with cattle, you know there are a lot of hard, hidden places up between the legs, behind the ears, in the ears, under the tail head. And is each inspector going to be conscientious enough to find all of the screwworm infestations in the animals that they inspect? We're relying on humans. If they do it right, it can work wonderfully. And then you probably heard earlier this year, back in January, the USDA reported that during a routine USDA inspection at an equine import quarantine facility in Florida, a horse arriving from Argentina was found to have an open wound containing larvae. The animal was immediately treated. Samples were sent to the National Veterinary Services Laboratories and confirmed as New World Screwworm. But this proves that the USDA's long-standing import inspection and quarantine protocols are another critical line of defense against New World Screwworm and other foreign animal diseases. If we do the inspections and we maintain the quarantine properly, It works. Quick summary here, there's no screwworm preventative. You cannot give your herd any chemical, any pharmaceutical, any medicine that will prevent screwworms. But relationships with your veterinarian will be crucial because the products that are going to be available will be available by prescription only. This makes sense because we want to make sure that the products are used for control of screwworms and not just willy-nilly applied to animals, because if they are, then we'll end up with resistance to those products. Pesticides are not the solution to screwworms. You can spray your herd with everything you can get your hands on, and that will not deter screwworms. A female screwworm that is ready to lay eggs is going to find an animal to lay those eggs on. When a fly is ready to lay its eggs, it lays its eggs. And they're going to find some animal with a wound to lay their eggs on. We do know the sterile insect technique works. It's a proven method. We can do it. We just have to exert the will to do it. And that's a government policy. It has to be, these decisions have to be made at a level way above my pay grade. But we know what works and we need to do it. All of these images have been provided by the USDA Animal Health Inspection Service. And if you need to contact me, Dr. Whitley knows where to find me, but there's my email, nhinkle@uga.edu. Now, any questions I can address?
I wanted to know if there's a certain time of year that they're more productive than any other time of year.
They do best in warm weather. If the temperature gets cold enough, they will die off. That's one thing that worked in our favor when we were eradicating them, is that we only had to release sterile flies during the warm months of the year. We'd have 3 or 4 months during the winter when it was too cold for them and the population would die off naturally. Southern Texas, it never gets cold enough. South Texas is just going to continue to have screwworms unless we eradicate them. One thing I didn't mention is they have already started a facility in Texas. They've broken ground, but I don't know how much progress they've made. And I think we need to emphasize to our congressional leaders, Senate leaders, that this is important. They need to make this a priority.
Let's let Dr. Jones, if he's ready to talk to us a little bit about what we might could use for fly control, including screwworm, and he might answer some of the questions that are out there as well.
Thank you, Nikki. All right, so this is a really good, and it does say information for veterinarians, but it also applies to you guys as producers, and this has a list of all of the current products and species that they're approved for. So you can scroll down here, and BI, we have ivermectin. Zoetis has Dectomax. You can see that Dectomax right here. Merck has a product called Exult. Exult is a pour-on, but it's only to be used in cattle older than 2 months of age. So as Dr. Hinkle mentioned, that one of the favorite places of the New World screwworm infestation is the umbilicus. Matter of fact, some of the calves in the U.S. that have been discovered have had an infected umbilicus. So umbilicus treatment is going to be something that may be critical for some of as a matter of fact, some of the countries that deal with this now. Part of our professional services team is actually going to be in Mexico in 2 weeks. We're going to visit the University of Mexico and then spend some time on a ranch and just look at some of the ways that producers down there, farmers down in Mexico and indeed South America, how they live with this. That there are countries south of us that have dealt with this for years, and they still raise a lot of cattle. And so this is not, it is serious. It is bad news for sure, but is it the apocalypse? No, not really. So Dectomax is the injectable dewormer. It has to be the injectable version. Ivermectin, the injectable version. Now, right now, when you go to the store and you buy a bottle of Dectomax or you buy a bottle of ivermectin, and they can be bought over the counter, It's going to be CA. It's going to have a CA1 on it. And that's conditional approval. And so these are recommended for the prevention of infestation. Some people might ask, says, well, what about Cydectin? Cydectin is an injectable. What about long range? Long range is a more concentrated injectable. Cydectin are the molecules moxidectin, and long range or eprenomectin do not have the same activity against these larvae. And like Nancy mentioned, if you go out there, we see fly strike. Okay, so fly strike is when these blowflies find an infected tissue in an animal, an abscess or something like that, and there's dead tissue on the outside of the animal, and they lay their eggs. That's fly strike. Like Dr. Hinkle mentioned, the difference between fly strike and New World screwworm infestation is that the larvae in the New World screwworm actually burrows into the living tissue. And I'm told, I've never smelled it, I am told that it is a very unique smell. And so they're training animals, dogs, to sniff out some of these cases, like Nancy and Mr. Baker were talking about before. When I moved to Texas in the 80s, there were cowboys on those ranches that had treated New World screwworm cattle. And they had a product called, well, that tar stuff that they covered so that the flies couldn't lay the eggs on the wounds, and they covered it up and basically put a big tar, like a Band-Aid seal over it. They also sprayed some stuff in there. So, and I'll talk a little bit about treatment here in just a second. But one of the cowboys that I worked with there on one of the ranches, he said he made good money because he had 2 dogs and a horse that would ride, and they'd catch the dogs would run through the pasture or through the woods with their noses up in the air, and they would smell this very, very characteristic smell, and they'd light out and they'd go find that cow. He'd ride in, catch it, rope it, tie it down, treat it, and release it. And so there's guys got really, really good at roping in those days. So obviously you guys, I'm in Georgia. I've got cattle. I'm not going to do any roping. And one of the reasons I was late, I was weaning some heifers and I got run over. So I don't do things Western anymore. So anyway, this is a list of different things. You can see some of them are listed for dogs. Some of them are listed for cats. It's the same actual product. Some of them are listed for cattle. NexGard for dogs, cats. There's some antiseptic wound spray. This spray right here, this Catron, you can buy this at Tractor Supply. There's another one that I had. This one right here, you can buy at some livestock supplies. It's actually called screwworm aerosol, and you can spray it on the outside. You can use a product like ivermectin. You can give them an injection of ivermectin, and that will work from the inside out. And then you can use this fly spray from the outside and treat. What's recommended if you do actually have an infestation, is that you pour hydrogen peroxide. Now, hydrogen peroxide is not, doesn't sting like an alcohol pour on or something like that. Pour out hydrogen peroxide and actually boil those larvae out. Collect those larvae, kill them or send them in, like Nancy said, take them somewhere that can be identified. But then you treated it from the inside with either ivermectin or Dectomax, and you treat it outside with one of these sprays, and then you can give an antibiotic that's appropriate for a skin infection. Something like Draxxin that's appropriate for pneumonia or foot rot would not be appropriate so visit with your veterinarian so that you can have this drug on hand if and when it comes to our area. Right now, it is over in the Southwest western part of Texas, and there is an infestation zone and then an area surrounding that there are restrictions on travel and any livestock transport, but we do see more and more cases occurring. The one in the dog went to New Mexico, I think that really was a case of the dog had traveled in a New World screwworm infested area. So yeah, we're just seeing more and more cases. So, and we really don't know exactly how it moved, but there were cases to the west of Texas. If you look at a map, you can see that there's a lot of Mexico west of Texas, and so it had just moved kind of lateral over the Rio Grande to the east. So anyway, as so for us, and then let's see, Dr. Rollins talks about the 5 point plan, and those points are just like Dr. Hinkle mentioned. They're going to use the sterile male release. They've used baits, the bait stations that are attractants for some of the areas. Now, we wouldn't want to use bait stations to kill our sterile released animals, but widespread insecticides is not practical because of all of the non-target species that would be impacted, for instance, honeybees or anything like that. So any kind of broad, widespread use of insecticides probably isn't useful. Or it might be useful, but it would have such a negative impact on non-target species that it would be the cure would be worse than the disease. The thing that you guys need to do with your cattle is frequent observation. Ideally, we're going to be wanting to look at these cattle every day. And then you're going to want to be on the downwind side of your cattle. So if there are any infections in those cattle, you're going to be able to smell them. Hopefully, you're going to be able to get close enough on your four-wheeler or whatever. You might take some of those bags of keeper cubes so that your cattle get a little spoiled and they'll come and line up and you can ride around. And as Nancy said, there are a lot of places on the animal that we can't necessarily see. A newborn calf, if we have an opportunity to treat the navel and we can give it this ivermectin or Dectomax, that will help prevent for maybe as much as a week until the time that navel will go ahead and dry up and begin to close. So we may treat it with some spray. Do not use the really strong iodine. We'd want to use something more gentle, because the strong iodine can actually cause more swelling and more opportunity for the navel to stay open, which would give more opportunity for the screwworm to lay its eggs in there. So castration, dehorning, those types of things, we just want to treat those areas, make sure that we coat them good with an insecticide, and then we keep an eye on it. Again, the flies are, I think, well over 1,000 miles away right now. So the chances for the many places in the Southeast, so although that, I apologize, I think the one person there is in Texas. So these types of things, you're going to want to make sure that you're frequently looking at your animals. If you have a veterinarian and they're not aware of this information from the Food and Drug Administration, we've got the different drugs that are approved for treating in the New World screwworms. There is some guidance for the veterinarians as far as using other drugs that maybe have yet to be approved for treatment. And so that's called the extra label use of animal drugs for New World screwworms. So there's some guidance there as far as the ins and outs of extra label drug use, a resource for veterinarians and that has to be by prescription. So I think that's all I've got. Got any questions?
This has been recorded, and I will edit it down, and I'll post it on my YouTube page. And there are several, informational links, including what Dr. Jones was showing that, yeah, we can try to share that with your vet. Dr. Jones mentioned using hydrogen peroxide to boil the maggots out, and then it's actually recommended online to put them in rubbing alcohol, 70% alcohol, and taking them to your county extension office, diagnostic lab, somewhere to have your vet to have them identified. And so the alcohol kills them. The peroxide will get them out without, like he said, without burning the animal like alcohol would. And then, but you do want to kill them because if they're mature, you don't want them to get into the soil and be able to pupate and grow into a fly.
Hey, Dr. Whitley, this is Dr. Poteet. I want to introduce myself. Sorry. I work for Georgia Department of Agriculture, and so I was going to say that as far as collection for the maggots, you can put them in alcohol. That preserves them, and call the Georgia Department of Agriculture, because someone from Animal Health will come and collect them, or they'll tell you how you can submit them so that they can test them. And then I guess for the state of Texas, it'll be the same. You call your Department of Agriculture. They're the ones that are taking in the submissions for the maggots. So the biggest thing is collect the maggots. If you see maggots, collect them so they can identify them.
Thank you.
And they are doing these areas on my screen right now. There's an enhanced control going on right now. So they are releasing sterile flies in these regions. The USDA is actively working on this, and they've spent a lot of money, closed the border. They've done a lot of things. So a lot of things going on, a lot of moving parts to this. And but the folks your Texas Animal Health Commission is on top of it, and the USDA people down there are on top of it, and they've got people riding the Rio Grande, actually looking for wildlife that is infected.
That video, I put the link in the chat box. These are some of the screenshots from that video that I emailed you guys, if you're on the email list. But this is what I was talking about, how it has like really good information. There's, again, other things. I put some pictures in there just because nobody talks much about birds because it's not as common for birds to host it, but birds can host it. So these were just some of the things. There's how to find a veterinarian. It's not in Georgia yet. And if everything works out smoothly, they will eradicate it before it gets here. And if that doesn't happen, hopefully it will take months to years before it would get here. Hopefully we can slow it down, but the hope is that it would actually be eradicated and they'll get rid of it before it ever gets here.